Hello everyone, my name is Meighan. Thank you for taking the time to join our presentation on the short film Children Full of Life. We have myself, Jen, Katie, Erin, and Meighan presenting to you today, and we can't wait for you to see where we went with this assignment. We have chosen the scene at 1940 where Mr. Kanamori is furious that Yo2 cannot stay on task, and he is choosing to exclude him from participating in the rafting activities. We also chose the scene at 24 minutes where the students are rafting. The big question that we've chimed into is whether or not education indoctrinates or liberates. We have Erin discussing the historical aspects of education, Meighan discussing the sociological aspects of indoctrination versus liberation, Maria talking about the policy in relation to the New Brunswick Education Act, Katie discussing the hidden and null curriculum, and Jen touching on the idea of whether or not Mr. Kanamori is a liberator or a benevolent dictator. Erin will start us off.
The historical perspective on education. Education is vital and has been around for generations, but what motivates teaching and how we learn is always adapting. As history progresses forward, so do our morals and what content we want students to consume. One of the essential concepts explored in the course this year was the idea that learning has become about consumerism. Students have become consumerists within the school system. Brands and corporations target young students at an optimal age to get them hooked on a consumerist lifestyle that they believe will lead to happiness. Occasionally, students are not the only victims of falling onto a bandwagon. So are their educators. This creates an education system that can be dictated by brands. In contrast, Mr. Kanamori's classroom is run from a very different approach than most Western culture classrooms. He is not persuaded by brands or corporations in his teaching practice, but instead follows his morals and code of conduct. His students are expected to support each other and learn to forge their own path to lead to their happiness. He also believes that the students learning kindness and respect for their peers will lead them towards success, values their opinions, and does not teach to indoctrinate a consumerist lifestyle. What is perhaps most inspiring about Mr. Kanamori is his conviction towards his students. In both of the scenes that we analyzed, it is clear that he has high expectations of his students, but that he is a fair teacher at the end of the day. Although his passion and sometimes anger cause the students to become emotional, he also draws out honesty and courage. The New Brunswick curriculum does state many of the values that Kanamori instills in his students, but it perhaps does not consider the many factors that educators face. For example, sponsors of individual schools having sway over opinions and perspectives in New Brunswick school systems. Although it is hard to say whether Kanamori experienced similar plights, something tells me he would likely ignore interference and charge headlong into his lesson plan, unencumbered by others' opinions. His students learned more in 2 years when he had them about emotional intelligence and integrity than many experienced throughout their young academic years. Mr. Kanamori was not teaching in a way that created cookie-cutter students, who all think the same way or who follow leadership blindly. Instead, he taught them to stand up to authority when unjust or corrupted. He did use indoctrination to teach them valuable lessons, which then led them towards liberation.
Education both indoctrinates and liberates. It's important to bear in mind that indoctrination into a school of thought can actually foster liberation. The clip we focused on from Children Full of Life demonstrates the belief that individual actions have individual consequences. This notion of the value of the individual and the subsequent responsibility of said individual is the foundation of Western thought that is instilled into children from a young age. This can be considered indoctrination. However, if viewed positively, the child learns that their actions have consequences, and further that they are in control of their opportunity based on personal choices. Moreover, the children who then decided they didn't want their classmate left behind exercised their individual choice and agency to allow the student not to be excluded. They used their individual rights and responsibilities, which a Western indoctrination fosters, to do good. Had the teacher allowed the student to participate without group advocacy, we may have seen resentment and hostility within the children. Instead, however, we see skills that foster community through agency and responsibility.
The idea of whether or not education indoctrinates or liberates was a major portion of our discussions about this film. We couldn't help but compare it to our views of the education system. Throughout the film, Mr. Kanamori has instilled in the children the beliefs of courage, justice for their peers, and respect for everyone. He has taught the students to stand up for what they believe is right. I believe this falls under the New Brunswick Education Act, specifically under the Duties of Teachers section, where one of the duties states, exemplifying and encouraging in each pupil the values of truth, justice, compassion, and respect for all persons. Through his teaching, I feel that Mr. Kanamori demonstrated just that, and this really showed in the scene where he was punishing Yuto for not staying on task while building the rafts and not allowing him to participate. Multiple children then stood in his defense, asking him to allow him to complete the activity. I believe that Mr. Kanamori instilled these in his students and encouraged each of them through his teaching to value trust, justice, compassion, and respect for all persons. The children demonstrated this willingly and on their own. This demonstrates that the children are in fact being indoctrinated to follow his beliefs that these aspects of life are important. In my opinion, these are positive beliefs to instill in the students, but there's still a set of beliefs that he has taught them to believe in, therefore causing the scenario to be indoctrination rather than liberation. In the following scene, Mr. Kanamori was just as happy as the children were that everyone was able to participate, and we all got the same feeling in our discussion that he was proud to see what his students demonstrated. This feeling of happiness may have resulted from the fact that the students were behaving in the way that he has taught them to.
Okay, so I will be presenting on the curriculum notes of Children Full of Life. And we just wanted to say before we got into it that we are generally unfamiliar with Japanese curriculum requirements, but the curriculum that Mr. Kanamori teaches is very different from the grade 4 curriculum of New Brunswick, which is centered around knowledge acquisition and scholastic skills. The kind of interpersonal skills Mr. Kanamori teaches would be considered a part of the hidden curriculum in New Brunswick, and his taught curriculum would put much more focus on children's social development than on the official curriculum requirements, at least from what we see in this documentary. So that brings us to the hidden curriculum. The first part is Mr. Kanamori's intentional hidden curriculum, or the part that he knows he's teaching and is trying to instill into his students that isn't part of the standard curriculum requirements. Mr. Kanamori's class's goal for the year is to learn how to live a happy life, be kind, and take care of each other. The goal is not hidden per se, but it is part of the hidden curriculum. Mr. Kanamori is teaching his students what a good citizen looks like. And alongside the scholarly requirements of grade 4, the students are being indoctrinated as good Japanese citizens. And according to Mr. Kanamori, a good Japanese citizen is emotionally intelligent, empathetic, and ever mindful of how their behavior affects the good of the community. This is clearly what Mr. Kanamori intends for his students to learn. The next slide brings us to the second part of the hidden curriculum. Mr. Kanamori, possibly subconsciously, but also consciously at some level, teaches his students that the teacher, or authority figure in general, is the ultimate power. This is significant as it will eventually affect how the students understand their own relationship with their elders, the police, and the government. Furthermore, he is propagating the Japanese cultural understanding of respect and honor, which strongly influences behavior and cultural norms, with consequences for negative behavior not only affecting the perpetrator, but the honor of that person's family, or in this case, the class. In the miniature society of the school, the class is Yuto's family, and so Yuto's transgression reflected badly on the whole class and not just himself. This can be seen when Mr. Kanamori is asking the other students why they didn't stop Yuto if they knew what he was doing was bad. Then in the scene where Yo stands up to Mr. Kanamori and has the other students protest Yuto's punishment, He's clearly very nervous about speaking out against the authority of the teacher, and the class is successful in overturning his judgment, but Mr. Kanamori still has the last say. This adds to the idea that he is a benevolent dictator. But next it brings us on to the null curriculum. So the things that Mr. Kanamori specifically does not teach. One of these is the traditional Japanese stoicism. He instead chooses to teach his students how to tap into their emotions and express themselves in a healthy way. He also notably does not teach the kind of toxic masculinity that we see often in North America that restricts the boys' ability to cry, feel empathy, or show love for each other. Neither does he condemn the girls for being too emotional, but instead invites them all to feel what they will and work through it together. Mr. Kanamori also does not teach his class to compete against each other for the highest grade or the best draft, but that the good of the class is more important than the good of any one person, or when one person is not happy, nobody is happy. He specifically avoids teaching his students the values that are so often unconsciously taught in the West, that individual gain and achievement is the goal, even at the cost of others' happiness or well-being. Next, we're going to talk about the Policy 703 and its relation to Mr. Kanamori's class. So they've listed some goals here that are set out by the New Brunswick Department of Education, specifically in Policy 703. I'm not going to read them for you because I trust that you can read. But basically, it's talking about molding their students into a good citizen and creating a safe and happy work environment at school, and creating good relationships with the students. So when it comes to Mr. Kanamori's teaching and Policy 703, we can evaluate him on a couple of fronts here. So he fulfills this responsibility to create a safe and comfortable learning environment, and that the students have at least one positive connection with an adult in the school. You can see this at the very beginning of the film when all of the students rush in and scream and yell and are happy because they have Mr. Kanamori again this year. He constantly models good citizenship and civility. It's like the number one thing that he teaches in his class. And his consequences are generally fair, and he's willing to change them if the students deem them unfair, which we can see in the episode there with Yuto and Yo. And then furthermore, after that scene there, and the scene where they're all by the pool, Mr. Kanamori is really proud of his students for the way that they handled that situation. So clearly, he has a good relationship with the students, and a good handle on consequences and positive learning environments. The only problem that I saw, and this is also keeping in mind that this is a translated version, there's a lot of cultural differences, so perhaps that is where the issue lies. But that being said, he condemns the child when he's confronting Yuto. He says, "When are you going to get yourself sorted out?" And part of the New Brunswick Education Act says that we should never condemn the child, but only the behavior. And also he uses a very aggressive tone and body language, poking his fingers in Yuto's chest and yelling in his face. And the New Brunswick Education Act states that the discipline should always maintain a child's dignity. So in that case, Mr. Kanamori didn't exactly pass, but overall he seems to be a good teacher and have a good handle on creating positive classroom environments. And with that, I will pass it off to Jen.
Teacher as liberator or benevolent dictator. Carl Rogers envisioned teachers modeling their practice along the lines of the client-centered approach of psychotherapy. To be student-centered, teachers must be sincere, honest, and authentic, and demonstrate unconditional respect for learners. Mr. Kanamori often seeks to lead the students to catharsis to impart lessons of empathy, which speaks to a certain psychologically driven approach. While Mr. Kanamori would appear to embody parts of Carl Rogers' Teacher as Guide, the audience shouldn't be lulled into accepting at face value that the class is fully student-centered. Mr. Kanamori, as much as any teacher, can just as easily be viewed not as a liberator, but a benevolent dictator. When disappointed, he will pound his desk or tap students to emphasize his displeasure and use demeaning language to berate students in front of the class. Acts of contrition and expression of emotion by students are publicly performed those that meet Mr. Kanamori's subjective view of appropriate empathy and kindness are rewarded with equally public approval from an authority figure. Indoctrinating a collective sense of community under the authority of a single individual can be liberation, or it can be the opposite. In science fiction, we have the example of the Borg, who assimilate species from various worlds, replace elements of their biological selves, and share a collective consciousness in which individuality is erased in favor of group unity. There's no infighting or conflict within the collective. There's peace, but no freedom. The Borg are an example of when collective consciousness and well-being is taken to an extreme and then imposed upon other groups. Historically, education has been and remains a target for government structures to develop the ideal citizen, whether to support polygenetic ultranationalism or a consumerist democracy. At the center of any system are notions of power, purpose, and meaning, and through education these are transposed onto emergent citizenry. Education requires that students perform for authority, and the imposition of any value should not be construed as benign.
To offer a brief summary, we have come to the conclusion that Mr. Kanamori indeed does indoctrinate his students to accept the importance of emotional intelligence, empathy, and to produce a sense of community where students must always treat each other and others in the community with respect. There are multiple aspects of the New Brunswick Education Act that we see within Mr. Kanamori's teaching, including the teaching of respect, compassion, justice, and trust. We also see multiple resemblances between his teaching and the New Brunswick Policy 703. The only concern that we had was the fact that he condemned the child rather than the behavior. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our presentation.